and at staff and Natural Resources Defense Council. Thank you all for joining us for our third series on making the case for racial equity. So just as a background for folks who had not been able to join us on the previous series, we've had 2 series so far. The first one was led by Dr. Tiffany Manuel, and it focused on messaging with the Spark lens, but especially oriented towards displacement and gentrification, and how we could understand and reframe the key messages and audiences that really drive our work. Talk about what narratives work, what narratives don't work, what narratives will like get people coming to you, what narratives will send people running for the hills. So there was a lot of that discussion. And then the second was led by Dwayne Marsh on how we have and really arm ourselves with the right tools to make the case on racial equity, especially when we're talking to the public sector. How do we talk about things like history, the right amount of history, what type of history, what are those things that really bring people in? How do we break down and dissect bias and institutional and structural racism and inequities? And so really what we want to do as a result of having those 2 conversations, and we'll also share those materials after the call, but to keep the conversation going on a deep dive into the challenges that we face when we're doing the work for real. So not necessarily thinking about it or talking about it, but really we're doing and actively putting things into practice. So our speakers are all a part of the Spark family. We have, as you can see on the screen, we have Dr. Tiffany Manuel, who is the president and CEO for the CaseMade. And there's an organization that focuses on helping to make the case for systems change by aligning stakeholders and organizing resources for deliberate systems change strategy. We'll also have Dwayne Marsh, who serves as the Vice President of Institutional and Sectoral Change at Race Forward, really bringing a systemic analysis and innovative approach to helping us take on the challenge of racial equity, but really more towards action. And then from Atlanta, as well as Chicago, we have our family who's going to kick us off in the conversation. So first we have Odetta McLeish White, extraordinaire managing director of the Transformation Alliance, who is the collaborative force really focused on creating a more prosperous and equitable Metro Atlanta region. We'll also have Roberto Requejo, who is he's definitely a knowledge dropper extraordinaire and program director of the Elevated Chicago team, focused on community-led solutions to neighborhood displacement and inequities using the underutilized asset of public transit system. And he'll be joined in tag teaming his discussion on Chicago with Kendra Freeman from the Metropolitan Planning Council. And Kendra's one of the systems and policy leads of Elevated Chicago. And she produces some great documents that I would love if we can also share after this call. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Odetta and to Roberto to get us going.
Thank you, Sasha. And thanks for including Atlanta. And I'm sure Roberto's grateful to be included as well on this working session. It's kind of like a workshop. And you look very official, Roberto, in a tie and the pin and everything. You look like you're ready to ask some questions.
I know.
I'm pretending I'm a serious guy today.
You're a serious guy. All right. Roberto's got serious face on. Okay.
So, you know, Odetta and I talked a little bit in preparation for this, and we wanted to keep it light, but also meaningful in terms of giving folks some sense of the context that surrounds all things racial equity in the built environment in Atlanta and in Chicago. And I thought it would be a good idea, we thought that would be a good idea to ask each other some questions at this very beginning, very short questions that relate to our experience in the field. And I'm going to take advantage that I took the lead and ask Odetta, my friend and colleague, if you could give us a sense of how have you experienced the racial equity and inequity and also lack of diversity and inclusion, or places where that's present in Atlanta. And if you could give us both the professional, you know, perspective of it, like how do you feel as a professional in the field, but also your personal perspective. You have a number of instances of diversity like all of us, and I'm sure you have experienced some both opportunities and challenges in Atlanta. So Odetta, tell us your story.
Well, I was born in a small town in Massachusetts. Thank you. That was a great setup, Roberta. Happy to do this little interview with you today. And this is an interesting week, it turns out, for me to answer that question. I've had 2 or 3 days out of the 4 days of this week where the institutional sort of ingrained power structure of Atlanta have been on full display. And 2 of those conversations were with other women of color, Black women, who have stepped into institutional roles where they are supposed to be making change and are finding that they are not able to do so. So on a personal level, and in this job with Transformation Alliance, I've been able to say that I think it's one with the power of outside funding, to be very honest, right? It's made it possible for me to speak honestly about racial equity and its role in Atlanta and in the disparities that we observe. And people like that. I think pioneers on this feeling are probably Dwayne Patterson and Nathaniel Smith at Partnership for Southern Equity. They've been talking about this even longer than I have. And similarly, noticing a lot of nodding heads from the powers that be or from funders. People kind of get it intellectually, but have really not been willing to either fund the work or frankly make the personal change that is required. So I'm on both the personal and professional levels really getting reminded this week that without the personal transformation, we're only getting so far down the iceberg that we've been using to sort of describe deep systems change. Might be a little bit below the surface. We might get some policy changes. We might get some new resources or visibility, but there's a glass ceiling of power and influence that Black people and other people of color, if not Black people, certainly very few other people of color, other race, ethnicities get past this sort of ceiling of power here in Atlanta. So that is one of the reasons I was glad to put forth our policy platform for this session today, to see if there are strategies and ways that we could be deploying it so that it is more influential, that Transformation Alliance goes from a state of buzz to true influence. Or if that's not possible, like how far can we take it? And really being clear-eyed about how far down the iceberg or under the waterline we'll be able to get. So it feels like there's some softness in the market, so to speak, to use all of our capital talk, to make change around race and equity and diversity. But it's like a bedrock of white supremacy and racism that once you hit it, you realize you need like big drills. You need to dig into people's personal transformation. You need to learn how to become a teacher and to how to confront people. And if you're conflict avoidant like I am, that's a big learning curve. So a lot of this work too is how to frame and accept my authority and my role in pointing out to people when they are enacting a white supremacist model, teaching them that yes, we're all enacting white supremacist models if you've been brought up in the United States and up through the educational systems. And that's a very difficult pill for folks to swallow. And especially in Atlanta, that's priding itself on birthplace of civil rights and Dr. King, and look at our beautiful monuments in our center. The trappings are very seductive. And so a lot of the work is how to speak truth to individuals and hope that they will start to get to the systems we want to change.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Sorry to hear that it's been a challenging week for you, or that your Spark family is here after hours. So you want to details. And I wonder if you have a minute also for any hopeful opportunities that you see coming up, apart from the ones that you open every day with your work in Transformation Alliance.
Yeah, I think so. The women who I just mentioned that are in these structures and are struggling, they themselves are powerful women. And so I'm kind of excited to figure out inside game, outside game strategies with them so that TFA, which is protected by outside funding, and I don't really have to, tip my hat yet to local funders, and maybe that's a great thing, right? I can get a little more vocal about some things and give them a platform inside their systems to say, oh, but that outside person said such and such, we should be listening to that. Some of them have expressed they need that outside voice to convince their inside colleagues who are a little more timid. The Office of Equity and Inclusion from the mayor has been around for a little while and maybe not quite as robust as I would have hoped, but it's there. And also things like the Invest Atlanta, which is the city's economic development agency, being willing to even talk to us about equity evaluation inside their own financing programs. And so how do we, if they are even willing to talk to us and we just kind of keep coming back and answering every question, tackling every but for, every why should we, I feel like we're actually going to be able to get some of the financing tools to support some equity goals. And so that's a hopeful sign for sure.
Thank you.
So now it's my turn, right? I get to ask you a question?
Yes, it is.
All right. I know I have this really mischievous smile, like I'm going to ask you something dangerous, right? But I'm not. My question for Roberto is, what do you think it will take, excuse me, to really move decision makers closer to understanding equity and to recognizing their role in upholding inequitable systems? And then, of course, hopeful things in Chicago would be great to hear too, to keep my spirits up.
Okay, so I think to talk about what's going to take to move the needle here, especially in leadership, in the sector that dominates decisions in the built environment, I think it's important that we start by acknowledging where we are, right, and who we are as a city. And you all know this, but I think we need to keep reminding people this is one of the most racially segregated cities in the United States. And the segregation is not just that people are separated from each other by race, is that the indicators of health and wealth are very different. And in majority white communities, the life expectancy is up to 15 years higher or longer than in some majority black communities of Chicago. So that's a constant reminder that make whatever we are. For people, I feel that Chicago tends to want to forget and avoid this conversation. And the other thing that we need to when we talk about Chicago and what leadership here needs to do, I think we all need to understand also the history, right? I'm here with Kendra. Marley's off camera, but here today. This office is sitting on the birthplace of Chicago, right? And Chicago as a city started with a military occupation. A fort of the U.S. Army was established here, and that fort, mainly white soldiers and white generals, decided that they wanted to expel and get rid of the Native American people that were living here, right? So the city starts, the story starts with a traumatic displacement of the people who were already here. And if you take that, and that's the 19th century, mid-19th century, you go from there to today, our history is being one of constant and systematic displacement of people of color, as early as of a few years ago when we saw the sort of the end of the foreclosure crisis. But you think about the foreclosure crisis in terms of displacement, we had 400,000 foreclosure filings in the Chicago area in 7 years, between 2008 and 2014, I think. And those 400,000, the vast majority of those were in Latino and African-American communities. So yet again, thousands of families were uprooted and displaced for the benefit of white-owned organizations, in this case, the financial sector, right? So every step of the way and every piece or large investment that has come to town, highways, campuses, healthcare facilities, have been done purposefully to segregate and to separate and to extract wealth from communities of color. And you all are very familiar also with what happened with public housing in Chicago, which was used also to segregate and extract wealth, and is still alive and well today, even with the transformation that's taking place. So that's the context, right? And in that context, the irony of Chicago is that our leadership in the built environment, we have like the headquarters of the American Planning Association are here in Chicago, right? And we have a beautiful and very well-planned city with great bones architecturally. We have a very thriving architectural firm community. We have large corporations in engineering, in consulting here in Chicago. a lot of power is concentrated here, power that decides, where to build, how to build neighborhoods. But when you go and knock at their door and you ask what is the infrastructure that they have for equity, diversity, and inclusion, Kendra and I had a call with a colleague from across the pond in the UK, and we asked honestly, how do we compare, right? And they said we were really had very bare bones structure here in Chicago. We are very, very behind in, staffing, resources, policies, requirements in those organizations that in other cities across the globe, they do have a chief diversity officer, they do have an equity platform, they do have employee resource groups, they do have training, cultural competency, and here we just lack that infrastructure. So that's the where we operate, where Elevated Chicago operates, and so where do you start, right? When even the city of Chicago just appointed last year its first chief diversity officer in 2018, right? The first chief diversity officer reporting to HR, which as many of you know is not ideal, should be much more elevated. So I think that the three things, right, that leaders need to keep in mind when we're trying to move forward and looking at how the field looks, and Kendra's going to talk more about this later. But number one, and this is building on your comments, that there are three things that you as a leader in this field need to realize. You have a personal journey that you have to walk, and very often, and especially I would say I will call my fellow white males are very shy in sharing their experience, and they live on the shoulders of Black and Latino and women professionals and leaders the burden of moving forward the needle. So first of all, your personal journey is important. Second, your professional role as a leader, you gotta change your organization too, and then your role in your community, right? And community for some folks means that whenever you are called into a conference or you have a high visibility opportunity in an architectural conference or a developers conference or a financial services conference that talks about community development, you have to take the opportunity to remind everybody where you are in the journey and where the field is in the journey, right? So those three things I think are important. And then I think leaders need also help and support from the top and also from outside. So from the top, there are boards that they report to, and there are higher powers they report to, and they need to provide them with education and with inspiration, right? And also with incentives, so sticks and carrots, right, for inclusive behavior. So when I work at the Fed, for instance, I use this example a lot. In the last year that I spent at the Fed, the performance management of leadership included inclusive leadership, and people were ranked on how inclusive they were with their staff and colleagues, and their bonus depended on that. So that's a small thing, but it understands the message that your performance is high, as well as incentives for visibility awards and all that. And then from staff and from the outside, I think what leaders need is pressure. That inside-outside game is very helpful sometimes for them that you were talking about. Innovation and also partnerships. We have found that there are leaders out there that they would do more if only we partner with them, because they don't have the resources or the time sometimes to do things. So to your point, Odetta, about having funding that is not as tied or as rigid as the government is helpful. So those are some of the ideas. And then for hopeful things in Chicago, apart from all those challenges, I wanted to leave you guys with a few of the hopeful things. So of course, we have a growing movement for racial equity in the built environment. Metropolitan Planning Council really did a groundbreaking report on the cost of segregation, putting numbers as to how expensive our segregation has been for the business, government, and civic sector in town. So that was really a really helpful report that reminding a lot of people that we needed to start changing. The members of Elevated at different stages, they all have committed to racial equity, and they include civic sector, private sector, community-based organizations. And then at the city level, the Chicago Department of Public Health in Chicago is a member of our steering committee, and they have been really a model agency. One of the few, or perhaps the only one, that has come out there and talked about, admitted first the role that government has played in systemic racism in Chicago and took their share of the responsibility, and then did training other staff, community-based work, demonstrating that racial equity was their center and their goals. So the city had a few programs that I would say they are hopeful, but they're still pretty colorblind. Like we have a program that transfers some of the wealth that is generated downtown. So every time a high rise goes up, there are fees that they have to pay, and a portion goes to neighborhoods in the south and the west side of Chicago. It's called the Neighborhood Opportunity Fund. They just gave $25 million this week to small businesses and civic organizations, but still in its infancy and very colorblind. There's no admission of what that is supposed to be repairing, and there's very little technical assistance to grantees, so that's part of the issue. And then we're lucky also to have some collaboratives that have come together. So Elevate Chicago focuses on transit-oriented development, but we have Q, Chicago United for Equity, which is a new organization that is creating cohorts of leaders well-versed in equity in different fields. We have the Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation initiative of Kellogg has an office and a project here with 100+ organizations involved. And finally, as you all know, we just elected our first African-American openly gay mayor in history. So yes, so we are super excited about that, not only because of the representation, but because from day one, she has established a transition team and committees that require at every meeting that all the initiatives that are presented pass these a number of filters, including a filter for diversity and inclusion and a filter for equity. So different members of Elevated Chicago and myself are in different committees. I'm in transportation and infrastructure, and parenthesis, this is why I'm wearing this today, because I have a meeting afterwards, end of parenthesis. But it's really refreshing to show up at a table where it's 30 organizations talking about transit and infrastructure, and the co-chairs are all women of color, and the membership is very diverse, very diverse. So, and that happens in every committee. And in addition to that, every time that somebody comes up with an idea on an initiative, there is a requirement to run it by these filters. So you have to show me how that tax or how that policy is going to impact those that have been underserved and discriminated over time. So we're really hopeful for this. We're really pumped about inauguration in a couple of weeks, and looking forward to the opportunities that this new administration is already opening.
Great.
So I think Sasha will take it from here, or?
I think Sasha sets up the next little section for us.
So I think we just turn it over to Dwayne and Tiffany.
Helps to be unmuted. Thanks a lot for those contexts. And what's really powerful to me and what you guys both said is just how challenging this work is, but also how much opportunity is layered in some of those challenges. And so would love to explore both of those. And I think we're going to start with Odetta and thinking about how we can help you move forward. And I'm wondering, one of the things I'm wondering, what is centering the policy platform that you're trying to advance? Because I think when we think about the messaging, knowing what we're really trying to move and the desired result is always a good frame up. So could you share a bit about what that is?
Sure, and I apologize for the background noise. I'm in a co-working space, so I'll try to either speak up louder or manage the background noise when I'm not speaking. I think Ella did a kind thing and put the policy platform into the box, but can also pull it up on her screen just so folks that have a screen up can see what Transformation Alliance has put together. And just let me provide this little bit of context that we grew our membership last year from 18 to over 30 and had not looked at our multi-issue policy platform in well over a year. So it was a great opportunity to refresh our policy work. And in some ways, just doing that was part of the goal as a table, as a collaborative table. We reviewed the old statements. We had new members who hadn't seen it before, who made, some pretty core changes in terms of going from just a transit policy to a mobility policy. We developed this format where we have the "we believe" statements at the top to sort of give a sense of our shared values and our shared vision as an organization. And then how can we make this a reality? And here's where we don't want to have to go back and do that consensus writing process again every year. So the idea was to create some potential work that can go across maybe a year or two, or is broad enough that a variety of different initiatives could fit under it. Frankly, just getting this written was and finalized was a big deal. So Dwayne, your question is appropriate, but I don't know that I have a super clear answer. I would like for it to become a source document for members. They should feel able to speak from this document because they helped to create it. And also, as we are moving into strategic planning this summer, finding pieces we'd like to advance. But one of our challenges with the Alliance is everyone's got individual organizational work plans. So finding a way to incorporate this either through standing agenda items or such things to help us understand where some members' work has actually moved one of these items forward is a question, or something we're trying to hammer out. But to the broader purpose, how to make this an influential tool and something that's actually moving policy. We have some references to the city of Atlanta here because a lot of our work is focused, but we are meant to be more regional, and that we have been learning lessons that could be applied in other places. And the Metro Atlanta region is beginning to talk more about coordinated transit. We now have a group called the ATL, which is like 13, jurisdictions or something like that, all talking about transit and its impact and expansion or establishment. So a new willingness to talk about transit, and therefore our lessons around land ownership, racial equity, financing could really apply, I think, to some of those new places. So how can we have an impact with this policy work on a more operational level? So as with all things Spark and TFA, it's complex, right? We could decide a bunch of things. We are going to put some TA towards hiring a consultant to help us decide, is this about picking one thing out of each issue and making it move, or is it more about, listen, nobody else is going to talk about racial equity across policies, so should TFA focus on like a racial equity in all policies approach, like we now the health sector has a health in all kind of policies approach. Those were the kind of things that I was hoping maybe your probing questions would make me grapple with in the time that we have today.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I wondered if in this co-design that you did with allies and newcomers to the process, is it sufficiently binding that when people are off doing their issue, that the backdrop curtain could in fact be this policy platform? So I'm here on disability rights as a part of our commitment in the Transformation Alliance. I'm here on housing affordability on the TFA. And so that eventually the decision makers are hearing this theme and beginning to see the collective power in a way that they wouldn't if people just say, oh, this is a great platform, but only talk about their issue.
That's a great point. I think formal training, just already thinking that when we bring that consultant on board, one of the items would be to more explicitly train our members. We did workshops with folks. It was not just, hey, open up this attachment and read this document. We took time together as a collaborative to review and do small working groups and really kind of write this stuff. And then we, sent things around for editing. And we also had it in our annual work plan, day retreat at the start of this year, and people really started to take another look at it and gave me some more changes. So I feel like they've seen it through the creation process, but you raise a great point about how do we help them to absorb it. And I've only had maybe one or two members kind of reach out to me and they'll say, hey, can I say the following things from the policy platform in a meeting? And I'm like, yes, that's exactly the point, that this is your source document and you actually don't need to keep coming back to me. We've all agreed that this is what we want to say and work on. So I think we might need some more training or time together to really help people understand, you know, not that you have to agree with every one of, say, the 5 that are up here right now, but that these are documents, this is source language that you can use to bring TFA to your aid when you're in other rooms.
2 more thoughts, and then I'll turn to Dr. Manuel to see what she would like to add as well. One is, in your collective time, even doing some training on or practicing on how the different players would do that and letting each other see that exercise would help people to think about how they can make those connecting points. And then I'm struck also by you mentioning hitting the bedrock, or, you know, and having to figure out how to drill in. And I always say everybody listens to somebody, with perhaps a couple of notable exceptions that we know these days. But how do we actually have those people who are the ones that the hard to reach or turn are listening to start to carry that message as well? And so I'm wondering how much mapping you've done of.
I lost you right there, Dwayne.
I was just wondering how much mapping you've done of key decision makers who are resistant to bringing the frame, and who might be the messenger who can help shift their thinking or create an opening where you can make the compelling argument.
So that's some of the power mapping work, right? We had started Spark doing some power mapping. And I think some of that traditional power mapping would be good to refresh. If I'm getting cynical at all, it's around the idea that even the people we identify in a power map are not the people who are actually running things. And so how do we keep digging past them, and get into the real influencers who probably have a vested interest in keeping things kind of the way they are. So also Tiffany, messaging, right? I mean, I to be honest, I haven't put out that, you know, the press release or posted something like, "Woo, we've done our whole policy platform," because I don't want a flood of superficial questions about it, to be very honest. I want it to
we can hear
operationalize.
Odetta.
Excuse me? Excuse me?
And I don't know if you guys can hear us.
Can hear you now?
It doesn't look like anything's different on the wall.
Can you still hear me?
Yeah, you're good. I think Chicago, you guys might be having some audio difficulties on your end, unfortunately.
Did we? Kitchen here, Marley.
I see Marley on the case. All right, they've got it. Go ahead, Odetta. We'll help you.
Okay. So when it becomes time to release this more completely or more broadly, I'd love to do it in a way that, you know, Tiffany doesn't trigger the swamps, right? Really feel at least some one-on-one training that we've received from you and your work with frameworks about messaging and what you inadvertently trigger and the way you pose things. And I kind of feel like the first goal is to make my membership connect to this work meaningfully, to your point, Dwayne. And second, a close second, but sort of second, is also how to release this platform in a way that sets us up for more influence and not just a lot of buzz and talking. I'm going to go on mute now just to make sure.
Yeah, I was going to just add to your point, Odetta, and same thing for you, Dwayne, and just that you've got both visible and invisible sort of stakeholders as part of the process, and the sort of, you know, African American women that you identified at the top who are sitting ostensibly in very powerful positions are actually not the folks who are likely to be making the real decisions. They're in those positions as visible leaders, but as we know, right, the real decisions about how our communities are developed and who's investing in those communities, it happens right behind closed doors that many of us don't get the privilege to be in, right? It happens on golf courses and other places where people make decisions, and then 2 or 3 years later, after they've made those decisions, we find out about. But that doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities for us to engage and make a strong, powerful case for what we need, at least of those folks who we know are visible, and hope that those folks who are visible, we've shaped and changed them enough that they can carry some of the water back to those folks who may not be as visible as we'd like. So I think, you know, what's really powerful about both what you know, Roberto and Odetta, what you all said was I think you've done if we think about the fact that power is really distributed across your regions in ways that is challenging, a part of what you all are talking about is that your efforts already to try to bring those stakeholders together. The ones that you can tap and touch, y'all are trying to coalesce them around a vision, around a set of values. So I appreciated that, especially the values at the top of that messaging before you get to the values and the vision, and then talk about some meaningful, real kind of operational things that you can do. And the challenge that you all are facing is, in part, how do you make the case that those are the things that people should lean into, especially because you're asking folks to make some sacrifices and to do some things that they may not have done before that's out of the sort of business as usual, right? So, you know, so I guess, you know, when I think about this, there are a number of ways that organizations and institutions and the folks who represent those institutions sort of shift, right? I think about it 4 ways. One is what you all were talking about in terms of personal transformation of leaders and leadership, that you've got some of that happening where you got leaders who ostensibly, right, are making some of that transformation, and you all can do a lot to kind of help to push them in that direction by being very authentic and visible and holding their feet to the fire. They're sitting in front of you. It's hard not to appreciate, right, the power that you all bring as powerful stakeholders in the city without making some kind of transformation. So that personal transformation is important. The other thing is sometimes and I don't know that this is true of Chicago, Atlanta, I'm saying this in other parts of the country, Dwayne may be saying this as well, but some of the just triggering events that are triggering a different kind of conversation that are external for you all, but really important. I know it's in California, the wildfires and a whole bunch of other stuff, and in the southern part of the country, the hurricanes that keep animating these conversations about how do we recreate or how do we shape our communities, because you got to rebuild. But there may be some of those kind of big external sort of triggering events that are happening that you can lean to instead of saying this is the thing that should be animating potentially a different conversation. And then I think 2 other things. One is sort of social disruption, right? If there's, you know, some of that may be technology based, but some of it is there riots or there's organizing, new kinds of organizing and mobilizing in the city that's really shaping the conversation. And I know at least I see that happening in Chicago. You wouldn't have the mayor that you have right now if that wasn't happening. So there's a way to kind of touch point on that. And then the other part of that, the 4th way is sort of the case making and how you are bringing new folks to the notion that they have a stake in your success, right? And that's, I think, the piece that's missing is that they understand, I think, as you said at the top, intellectually they get it. Like they get that historically this has been a problem. They get that has real world consequences today. What they don't get is their stake in making this different and how they are incentivized to do that. And so what I'm interested in hearing a little bit, to the extent that y'all have done some thinking about this, is how are you helping them to see their stake in your success, whether that is policymakers at the city level and whether that's some of the developers, whether that is, you know, banks and financing institutions, but how are you helping them to see that your business model is determined in part by what's happening in this community? So you don't work well unless what we're doing works well. And so we have both a stake in this powerfully in helping them to see that. And I don't know and I imagine that you have done that in person, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, because that really is crucial as part of your case making, right?
Yeah, I was tapping notes. That's why I kept looking down. On 2 levels, like one is, you're right, we're certainly doing those things individually or saying those things, making those arguments in small one-on-one ways. Partnership for Southern Equity has really built a lot of its growth on the idea of equity as the better growth model, right? An economic development model. And so we certainly have access to a member that's building out more credibility. And I think we could do a better job in borrowing and elevating that. The other thing that you said that I was tapping out all 4 of these ways to shift power, the social disruption and how to leverage organizing. One of the conversations I've been trying to get TFA involved in is, I hear feedback. Is anybody okay?
Yep.
Okay, good. Is, you know, what is TFA's role in elevating grassroots organizations, right? The community development ecosystem is not healthy here because our grassroots groups are underinvested. As you know, we're not unique in this, right? But I'm realizing one of the ways that we're invested in their success that I haven't quite expressed is they are the ones that trigger some of this outside pressure point. And we need to be able, we need that happening so we can join it and leverage with it. And so it is directly connected to my success. So I think when I can also articulate better, not just this intellectual, oh, we need grassroots groups, but hey, I need Housing Justice League. And when they do a community action event and take a march, down to the Capitol, that's a moment that TFA needs them to be strong and able to do. So when I invest in their capacity and human capacity, that's the opportunity I'm setting up. I think that's going to be a powerful clarity that I'll be able to work into why we need them, why my specific work needs them. But number 4, this case making on how others have a stake in our success. Again, I think it's been made on research levels and intellectually, but we need to refresh that personal sense of connection to it and keep digging harder for more direct, Mr. Developer, you will save thousands of dollars if you do not, in faster permitting processes, if you have a great community engagement process or something like that. Some kind of way to make the work we're doing show up in the places that they care about most. I think we have more to do on that front for sure. So I'm grateful to have that underscored in this conversation.
Are we going to be taking or getting questions from the our participants as well? Because I think we should make sure that we work those thoughts, reflections in as we go. So I just wanted to lift that up. And then I guess the last thing I'd love, or not the last thing, but another thing I'd just like to know is, coming back to the power mapping, the people who have influence, do you have a sense of, or have you seen messages that look like they might actually resonate or give you an opening to make headway with either the power elite or the influences of the power elite? Or is that research to be determined?
I think that's to be determined. I feel like I don't have access to anybody to help me even gut check if what I think is right is right. I think I know what to say, but I don't have the relationships and the power connections that I've activated, if I have them, to help me really get at it. I think people will nod and say, oh, that sounds great. And they will not share their real motivation. They will not share that, that's my worry, maybe more than anything. And so I don't know if that's a personal growth point that I need to just stop worrying and go ahead and try anyway. But what I don't want is to be sent off down any kind of rabbit hole and spend my precious time and my members' precious time on a message that's not actually being absorbed. So I guess I'm hopeful or want more ways to make sure that I pick the right thing.
And on that, what's your relationship or engagement with philanthropy in the region that often can be the connective tissue behind some of these sectors we're talking about?
Dwayne, I think your audio kind of went to a little bit of a weird place for a minute.
Oh, I was just asking a follow-up to say, what is your relationship with local philanthropy? Because often they may have the access to the influences we're talking about who we don't get access to. And they might be the messages need to carry this frame or inspire people, or even introduce somebody could be an influencer of means who's not, because they just aren't engaging in the conversation.
Got pretty traditional philanthropy, pretty conservative local philanthropy. The relationship building work that I've been doing, for example, with the Black women I mentioned earlier, are people who could help us get to influence there, but I see the boards behind either my friends or their executive directors, and those boards are where there's a lot of pushback and struggle for people who would be more progressive to make change. So again, I see, to Roberto's hopeful question, the presence of those people, if they were, means that we have some allies inside groups like philanthropy. I think the philanthropy is muted by their own boards of directors, and that's tying right back to that original power structure that, you know, white and old, and sometimes here in Atlanta, you know, African American and old, but they are united in preserving access to resources and prestige. So I hear what you're saying, and I could, you know, my one answer is I know I have some ins with people. I worry that they remain disempowered by their boards, and I don't quite know how to get to their boards. So to Roberto's point about getting into power structures and the educating them, I'd have to educate everybody around them. I don't know, or wait till they pass away and hopefully they have progressive grandchildren.
Oh, no. They'll last forever.
The old death strategy.
Attrition.
I want to just encourage you, Odetta, as you're thinking about the mapping and who those folks are and getting access, both the visible and those who are not always visible in these issues, to be thinking about it all levels, kind of what is the thing that brings them forward. I think when I look at the values that you articulated, I think that especially in Atlanta, I have a hard time believing that those values are in question. And you're right, in Atlanta in the 21st century, I'm gonna just be generous and say, like if you don't already believe that those are the values that should be animating action, then shame on you, and we're gonna move you aside. But it's not the values in question, is that, you know, it's a sacrifice that you want them to make, or that there's something that is going to, I don't want to say burden them, but you're asking for something, and they got to know, why should they act? What is the thing that, you know, what is the thing that they fear, right? More than doing the thing that you're asking of them. And so, you know, as you think about those stakeholders, right, think about what is the thing that makes them lean in, right? Is it that they get from going through the list of things that you put in the policy platform and actually following through with what they should do? I mean, if you think about, you know, many of the sort of major stakeholders in Atlanta, and probably it's just true of Chicago as well, you know, the way I think about this is that, you know, increasingly around the business model, their business model, right, assumes that there are stable communities across the region. They can't operate, right, in this, right, business and investment doesn't operate in great uncertainty. So when Roberto's talking about the turnover that just happens even in foreclosure, that is just an amazing amount of uncertainty that's happening it's hard for businesses to operate in that climate and environment. And when you think about the sort of, even in the short term, the sort of technology that's coming online, all of those folks, for example, healthcare, right? Some of you, right, we know in housing, a lot more of those increasingly healthcare dollars are beginning to be invested in housing, not just as a mistake, but because healthcare organizations, the new business model is more about healthcare is going to be delivered in our communities and at home. Right, but they can't deliver that. That can't be the new source of, right, the delivery of healthcare if people don't have stable places to live and they don't have communities that are stable as well. So there's a natural inflection point in which some of these healthcare institutions should be and are thinking about how do they make thoughtful investments in what you all do, and they could also be animating a larger conversation about the success of the neighborhoods and communities that you're all serving. The same thing is true in education. The new business model in education is educating folks at home, right? So Strayer, Phoenix University, all of the major universities have these at-home platforms. In addition to professional, right? Most of the continuing education courses, they're not in the community colleges anymore. They're at home online. And so their business model, right, is that people have stable housing and stable places. But if that doesn't exist, right, no way to sort of make that business model a reality. So I could literally go down the line and talk about each of the stakeholders that you're likely to be engaging with who are not fully present yet, to how much they need, right, the fact that you're stabilizing communities and neighborhoods and in a way that is getting rid of or addressing these issues of, you know, racial segregation and equity issues, right, which makes for a better business climate, and that they should be leaning forward in part because they have a vested interest in what you're doing, not because they think this is charity, not because they just like you as a leader, not because it's Tuesday and right, but because there's a larger set of rewards that they're getting as part of the investment that they're making in your communities. So I guess what I would say is, as you go down the list of the folks who are your stakeholders, right, what is the thing that helps them to lean forward? And I would, just say as you both, Roberto and Odette, as you think about that, I always sort of lean on this old Alita Adams song. You remember she had this song, I don't care how you get there, just get there. Like, you can reach me by railway, you can reach me by sailboat, you can come by train or trailway. I don't really care how you get to racial equity. I don't care if you come because you think that it's morally reprehensible not to address these issues, or if you get there because you think it's a part of your business model, or if you get there because you just, appreciate Odetta and Roberto and you trust them as community leaders. I don't care how you get here, just get here. So your task is to figure out, right, what's the way to get each one of those stakeholders to that table in whatever way, shape, or form that happens, right? I don't care how you get here, just get here, right? So
I'm trusting our tech team will be queuing that song up for the fade out when we finish up this session here. Are we going to, should we pivot to some time with Roberto and Kendra?
yes.
Oh, before we do, one last thing. Keep it local, but make this a national story. There's nothing like the pressure of the rest of the world watching to have people get on their best behavior. And this is where the Spark superstructure can be useful to lift up what you guys are about and have these people who are in the shadows of conversation but holding power recognize we're being looked at is great, especially if the light's shining bright enough that it cuts around the corner to the shadows that they're hanging out in. So just something to hold on to as we head north up multiple interstates to get to Chicago.
Is that my cue?
I believe so.
That's a cue.
Alrighty. So I want to acknowledge that a few Spark members have joined us off camera. Devin and Megan from Enterprise and Sandra from Lyft are here visiting Chicago and joining us for this call. And I have the pleasure of introducing you all to somebody that many of you already know, Kendra Freeman. Get closer. Kendra is the Director of Community Engagement at the Metropolitan Planning Council. Metropolitan Planning Council is one of the 17 members of the steering committee of Elevated Chicago and a founding member, and Kendra was instrumental in being part of the application that we submitted to Spark, and she's been an amazing mentor for myself and an amazing teacher and trainer for the rest of the steering committee in all things racial equity. She has extensive experience in affordable housing and community development and the hard conversations that need to take place in communities that are being gentrified. She was part of the teams that were redeveloping public housing in Chicago as part of the Chicago Housing Authority Plan for Transformation, and she is a national expert in equitable TOD and the person that we all call locally every time there is a question about how do we make transit-oriented development more equitable in Chicago. So with that, I'm gonna let Kendra take it from here. The initiative that we selected for today is one that MPC and Kendra have really been pushing for us, which is how do we develop a diversity, equity, and inclusion curriculum, cohort, and track for leaders in the field that impacts the built environment, whether it's the private sector, the public sector, or the civic sector and anchored institutions. I'll let you take it from here, Kendra.
Thank you, Roberto. I should let you revamp my resume online. You did such a great job. So hi, it's great to join everyone. Before I kind of shift into our DEI framework, so your last comment, Tiffany, is just resonating with me because before I came here, I spent time with our board and committee members who are primarily white, affluent men, having a conversation as part of our cross-committee forum. So we had someone come in from the transition team to talk about Mayor-elect Lightfoot's priorities and some of her values, particularly around equity and transparency. And we were having this conversation about changing the culture of planning and potentially having a need for a comprehensive plan in the city of Chicago and how do we make that happen and kind of the need to re-envision what that looks like. And I think, to the point of kind of getting to the people however you can, there are many folks around that table who are, leaders of large business corporations. And as we were talking about different strategies, one of the comments was, at the end of the day, businesses are in business to make money. So like, how do you tap into those self-interests, I think is really important. And just reflecting back on our cost of segregation work, being able to get to those corporate venues, sometimes through our board and committee members who we had to spend a couple of years, Tiffany, as you know, because you helped us with this process, bringing them along to be able to get them to open some of those doors, to be able to share that that information was really, really important. So I think that takes different frames depending on, what sector you're talking to. And I think here in Chicago, we've, in times had that challenge of making the case at the corporate level and also making the case with the public sector as well, when there's kind of a default attitude of, we're working in, West and South Side communities, so we are doing racial equity. What are you guys talking about? So focusing our discussion, which is part of the reason why I think we really wanted to focus in on how do we build and begin to normalize these conversations locally about diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly around community development and housing, where everybody knows it's a part of it, but it seems just very disconnected when we get into our planning hats and talking about where we're going to focus investments and making those core decisions. So if, I don't know who controls the slides, but if I can have the first slide, is it something I'm supposed to do?
I'll bring it right up.
I think Tasha is the master of slides.
Thank God I'm not in control of.
I know Ella's pulling it up right now.
Okay. Well, eventually there's going to be a slide that comes up that kind of talks about the field with the challenges that we face today and how that impacts communities. And the bottom line is, again, diversity, equity, and inclusion is not typically part of the conversation. There's the first one. There really is no vision or no strategy, or there really hasn't been. We have these really typical problems of teams and kind of who's showing up in the spaces around planning and investment, who's making decisions about how community investments are happening and what gets done and what deals get done. Those teams lack diversity. It's a very homogeneous group of people, and there's not very much inclusion in the process whatsoever. And obviously, when you have that structure, it shapes how, what you get at the end of the day. It shapes how decisions are made around how capital is deployed. It shapes the way we look at data. It shapes, what narratives eventually come out of it. And it impacts our communities in the ways that we've come to know that aren't a surprise to anyone either. We see the manifestation of segregation. We see health and wealth inequities. We see lack of ownership. This kind of stripping of wealth, particularly in communities of color, and the structure just continually kind of reinforces the status quo. So we've been segregated. We've had concentrated disinvestment in our city in certain areas for decades and decades and decades. And despite what administration changes or shifts of changes, if you're using the same structure, you're going to keep getting the same results. So in thinking about how do we begin to attack that, I think one of the things that we realized is when you look at the corporate sector, diversity and inclusion has moved to be, I guess, really a solid component of most corporate structures, and for some of the reasons we talked about earlier, just like it's more cost effective, it makes better business sense. The case for diversity and inclusion has been made for the most part in the corporate sector, and it's become more normalized. We don't necessarily see the marrying of diversity and inclusion and equity, which I think has more been a topic that's been coming up in the public sector, and maybe because of that public engagement that's typically needed in public projects, but you just don't see the marrying of both, kind of all three principles in one place. And I think that's particularly damaging when you think about the community development process. So our hope in looking at a diversity, equity, and inclusion cohort curriculum, and then eventually a leadership cohort, is to really bring all those principles together and to really do a cross-sectorial training where we're pulling together all the decision makers that touch the development process. So public sector folks, so planners and real estate developers, community-based organizations, even folks in development finance, all people who are kind of critical in this decision-making process. So in the second slide, you can see kind of the opportunity in looking at trying to change the structure once we really are able to articulate a goal and begin to build a diversity, equity, and inclusion framework at the top. We can use that framework to begin to build racial equity principles into things like strategy and strategic plans, and then processes and policy. And then hopefully now, because we do have a mayor-elect who are prioritizing a lot of these values, that there's alignment where there hasn't been before, with the vision for the city, along with the vision for the process that we like to see. And in building an inclusive process, I think you can do that in a couple of ways. Obviously, a big part of that is going to be normalizing a lot of the language, really understanding the history around disinvestment and structural racism that has really plagued community development particularly, has been perpetuated by governmental institutions, not just obviously in Chicago, but across the nation, and also beginning to turn that around. And how do you build a culture of inclusive leadership? And part of that inclusive leadership, I think, is really supporting authentic community engagement. How do we begin to center community voice in these processes? Building these processes that allow for two-way learning and sharing of information, and also building agency at the community level, having kind of this sense of ownership, but also having actual tangible ownership opportunities that build community wealth, and also sharing of decision making between community and the development community members and the development community, where that's possible. So this is where we're trying to get, and we really see the framework as being a start to that conversation. So what that looks like, I guess, in less techie terms, is we've identified a couple of core cohorts that we believe are necessary, building off of some of the curriculum and the principles that we've learned through GARE and Dwayne's work and others, and really starting that conversation, again, hopefully with a diverse group of cross-sectoral representatives who have some influence in the decision-making process, and building into that a very local history of how this is manifested over years in Chicago, and kind of how we got to the community situations that we get to now. And part of, I think, the overall goals is how do we equip the development community, but I think even more specifically our public officials, who often are the gatekeepers of development, to be able to use a racial equity framework to make better decisions. So it's really addressing those 3 points that Roberto talked to earlier, starting the personal journey and supporting people through that, but really also giving them a tools to look at, what are the institutional changes that could be made and the barriers that need to be taken down, and also what are the structural issues that could be addressed through policy in their position wherever they sit in the development ecosystem. So I'll pause there because I felt like I was talking a lot.
That's awesome. Thanks so much. And so I just want to follow up to those, Sasha, others moderating. Are we looking out for Q questions from the participants? I haven't seen any yet. I just want to keep an eye out if we should be. And I do have some thoughts, but I'll defer to Dr. Manuel first.
Dwayne, we've asked for questions, and if anyone wants to ask something but is on mute, just feel free to respond in the chat box and we can unmute you.
Great.
Yeah, so I have both a comment and a question. I think that is exactly right. I think you're trying to build a sort of common language and framework across all the folks that you're trying to align, and that is, especially the cross-sector folks, because you all are speaking different languages. There are different incentives across different sectors for the work that you're talking about, and there are also different disincentives. So getting everybody on the same page is really powerful. I guess my initial question is, you've identified some of the folks that you want to take through as a cohort that you think would be really helpful. To what extent are those folks already bought into going through as a cohort and sort of committed to that process? And how are you helping them to be committed to the process of actually going through that with you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we were lucky enough to bring some people together last month to really begin to socialize this idea and begin to ask those questions, and also kind of, I think, pre-screen some people who we may want to pull into the cohort. So I think, there are definitely people who are working at different stages who theoretically are bought into this, who I think are already like, hey, when you do this, let me know. I want to be in on it. There are people that we've cultivated, particularly I think within city government, that through our 2.5 years of Elevated Chicago, we've cultivated relationships with. We are in a kind of funny time because, we have a change in administration, so we're not sure how that's going to impact those people. But I think being able to walk with them and begin to introduce how Elevated works and pull them into our working groups and our steering committees and kind of expose them to different types of thinking and support them in ways that they need to be supportive, I think has been critical in helping them to get to a stage where I think, yes, they will see this as value. And I think, I guess I'm just thinking of a couple of cases, particularly with the public sector, where it's been building buy-in by kind of doing and showing through very incremental work of hoping to, change people's perceptions or barriers or doubts about why this type of work is valuable. I think typically the pushback that we've gotten in trying to have these conversations has been, this is great, but this is all about process. So what is this going to get me, in the end, or, if I have to deliver something in 30, 60, 90 days. And as you know, this work is not quick. And sometimes the most tangible results up front are more culture changes, and they're not necessarily kind of like in numbers. They may be more narrative. And I think part of that is getting people a little bit more comfortable with that, but also getting people more comfortable with a different kind of process. Because I think in some cases, people have been locked into a process and doing things a different way. And I think showing them that a different kind of process that brings different voices to the table, where particularly in the government context, those people may be yelling at you all the time. If you just kind of maybe change the timing of some of that, bringing them earlier, those people might wind up standing with you in the midst of a community meeting and helping to diffuse that versus, being the ones who are attacking you. So I think it's been like that kind of incremental, bringing people along and kind of holding their hands. And Roberto, feel free to jump in and showing them it'll be okay.
Yeah, and we have a trifecta right now that we need to take advantage of, which is the city, the county, and the state all have leaders that have made commitment to equity for the first time ever. So I think to your point, Tiffany, if you are in government right now in Illinois and you are minimally ambitious, you want to be on the side of the folks who know what this is about, because governor, county president, and mayor of Chicago are all talking about it. And if you are completely illiterate about that, you're going to have trouble moving forward. So I think there's going to be probably a renewed interest in this type of cohorts. And the other thing that I would say is, to the point about the process, as Kendra mentioned, our prior administration was very keen on reminding us that they wanted to see immediate results, right? And they didn't want process. And as a result of that, they have made very bad decisions about equity, because for them, equity meant, I'm going to drop $2 million in the West Side in this particular organization, take a picture, get the credit, and look at me, I did racial equity. What turns out, many of those organizations had to give back the money because the process itself requires so many matches and permits and stuff that organizations in some cases didn't know how to handle. And so it was more detrimental in trying to do the fast thing and the impactful thing. So some of us get agitated when people try to pit us against each other, the process people versus the impact people, right? And I think we have to be the same, one and the same, because again, the process, it's how you get there. You may be doing more harm than good. And you would be transforming what is what we call in Spark an adaptive problem into a technical problem, and it's not. it's not the money, right? The money is just one part. But when we go to conversations and people say to us, well, if only we had $1 billion or $2 billion, well, you had it. And you know what happened? The CHA happened. So that's part of the I think the challenge in dealing with the old guard versus a newer guard that is more process oriented.
Yeah.
So I have a question for Kendra for the slides that you showed us. And this comes from Victoria and Elizabeth in the Bay Area, who want to know more about how this was developed, how the I guess the process and the tool was developed. Was it something that you all did as a group or on your own? And how are people really receiving this kind of tool and information?
So I guess I should say the framework for the cohort itself is still in progress. So it's not necessarily a done deal. We've identified, again, some modules that we think should be part of the curriculum. We've begun to socialize those with a core group of people who represent different parts of the development sector. And we're pulling together a team to start hopefully cranking out content in the next couple of weeks. And our hope is to, once we get some solid content together, is to have some focus groups around that content, again, with a cross-sectorial group of folks to really give us some real-time feedback so we can go back and really tweak it and kind of have this process of prototyping and testing and reiterating so that we can come up with a really strong curriculum at the end of the day. And part of that is, being mindful of, again, who our audience is and how do we kind of navigate really, making that through line of structural racism to the manifestation of what we see today and bring in equity principles and also, not being shy about calling out a white supremacy culture and what that really means, when, we're going to have a lot of people, in that group who in their personal journey may or may not be really ready to really digest all of that. But the lovely visual came from Roberto.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was a team effort, and it was triggered in part by the innovation grant. If you all remember,
right.
Spark issued. Yes. So
you guys made us work.
Even if we did not get funded, and we have forgiven you all for that, the effort itself helps structure the case, right, in the form of these, this kind of quick ways for people to understand what is exactly the thing that Kendra and Roberto and a few others keep telling us about. And it helped us kind of like rally some troops and get some buy-in within our own steering committee, which I would say when we first started Spark, this was not necessarily top of the agenda, and now it is, and it's coming from both citywide organizations and the community trust and others, and also community-based organizations that feel the need to keep their public officials accountable to something, and this is that something. So thank you, Spark.
Am I unmuted? This is Elizabeth.
Oh,
Hi.
Yeah. Hi.
Hey,
So I just wanted to add a couple of exclamation marks to Sasha's beautiful interpretation of my question, because I also was saying how wonderful I thought this was as a tool to just describe this process. I think the two slides do just a really amazing job. So thank you for sharing. And just generally, thank you all for sharing this work. This has been kind of an amazing hour and 20 minutes so far. So thanks.
Well, now the pressure's on for the home stretch. Thanks, Elizabeth. I have 4 observations and a question. And so I will just do the observations first and then let you guys chew on the last one. The first is on the DEI framework that you're going to run this group through. If they have signing on for this, it's a huge opportunity to redefine what we mean by diversity, equity, inclusion. Our experience, and I think we talked about this in the last webinar, is that often the E is soft or even silent on DE&I. And so we need to make sure we redefine what we mean by this and help people understand this is a means to a result and an end, and we don't measure by the diversity we achieved or the inclusion in the conversation. We measure by the change in people's lives. And so really having them hold, you're helping us shape the new definition or the new generation of what DE&I efforts look like. So And there's things we can offer if that's helpful to help make that case really powerfully and analyze why D&I has been failing to this point, right? It's important work, but it hasn't gotten us where we're trying to get. Second thing I think is really thinking about examples that you can lift. Anything you have local is gold to say that this is the way in which we want to do this work, even if it's small. But then pairing that with things that have come from other places. My experience is people don't like to think things from elsewhere are helpful unless they think they can do it themselves as well. And so you have to kind of have both of those. Here's the local thing we've done well, and check it out. Here's something we haven't tried that worked in LA. And you have to find your contemporary, your counterpart places, because every city has that version of, well, that's cool, but we're Chicago, or that's cool, but we're Milwaukee, right? So you got to figure out who will they listen to on that. It's like a jurisdictional version of who will the individual listen to. Third thing that came to mind was this next of the mix at your party. And we talked more with Atlanta about the individual, kind of invisible influences. If you're getting some of those folks in the room, who are some emerging leaders or folks who may not be the typical candidates you could put in the mix of your cohort that gives them access to those players so that after this is done, they could potentially make a connection, pick up the phone, be listened to differently. So you're creating a peer space, and it almost is like everybody in that room has been validated as part of that peer space. And how do you take advantage of that? The fourth thought was about getting a mole. And hopefully from this process, if you're reaching power brokers, you're going to be listening and looking out for who are you really affecting or influencing the most in this conversation, who can become an agent working for you in those circles when they go back to the places where you don't have as much access to them. So really look to see who you're affecting and influencing deeply, because they could become a real ally once the process is done. All of that leads to my question in some ways, or maybe it's not leading to, but the one that I think was a good chew-on question, which is this moment with the new administration, new mayor in a city that's known for having generational leadership. I just love to hear a bit about how much openness and scrambling and opportunity is there, because in some ways, some of the rules are up for grabs, I would imagine, but I'm just wondering if that's the case or if things are kind of locking back into place pretty quickly.
I don't know. You may feel better equipped to answer that with your experience with the folks around the transition table.
So I've never been part of a transition process before, so I cannot compare with the prior ones. But just the first of all, the inclusion of voices and those unusual suspects that you are talking about has been very clear. Like, I think a lot of us wouldn't be there if that was not an intentional strategy, right? To get them in. It's a large number of people involved. I think when you put all together, all the members of the transition committees is over 400 people, right? So to your point, there is a significant amount of scrambling in that it's a lot of people, and many of them have never been at the same table before. So especially like in issue areas that have not been traditionally diverse, like transportation infrastructure, the one that I sit in, some folks I know are looking at each other like, who are you from, right? Like, where are you coming from, and why am I talking to you about, this, right? Which is great, but to your point, I don't think there is a hunger for doing something within the first 100 days that is very powerful and transformational. But a few of us within the transition teams are kind of making the leaders in the transition team and the mayor aware that we don't want to rush things, first of all. We don't want an Office of Equity that is not well funded. Right now it's not in the budget, so we don't want that. We don't want philanthropy to pay for it. Thank you, philanthropy, but that's not how we should do this, right? So we're trying to, number one, keep equity, diversity, and inclusion alive and well in every meeting, and have folks who have never had an answer to that at least try to answer the question of why do I have to include diversity and inclusion as a architect or as a police officer or whatever is your position. And while we're pushing for that and being very open about it, we are trying to slow down a bit the folks who are in some conversations around what should this office look like and what should equity look like, because we'd like it to be a thoughtful office and a thoughtful process, right? And we're sure it will be, but in the scrambling and in the trying to be with good intent, in trying to be transformational, we want if we have an equity officer coming up, we want him or her to be set up for success, right? And not to go through the usual turnover that many diversity and inclusion offices go in corporate America and other places, just because you try to address crisis too fast and you didn't provide the person with a team, a reporting line to the mayor in this case, dotted lines with the departments, and all of that. So that's where we are. There is a significant amount of good energy, but also some confusion and some question marks still as to how this is going to look like. And a few folks in the equity kind of field saying, let's do this thoughtfully, right? And let's be a leader to the country and not one more office of equity.
Yeah, and I do think Maurice, who's the chief of staff, who was with us this morning, I think he echoed that kind of, we have a ton to do, but it's all not going to get done by May 20th. So we're not trying to get everything done by May 20th. But I think also there's been some commitments to probably more transparency that we've seen in the transition process ever. Like, they posted all the memos online from all the transition committees. Like, you usually don't see anything about what's happening until the mayor rolls out their new plan. So I feel like those are indicators, and Mayor-elect Lightfoot, has been talked about as someone who listens, and even though we kind of have fallen into the same shell of the same people running the transition team, I feel like there's been some efforts to do things differently as far as sharing information, as far as listening and doing listening tours. As far as, even the fact that, they're interviewing existing, cabinet members and having conversations with them versus just like, oh, everybody's going out the door, as soon as we walk in. That is, I think, indicators for me that there is kind of an openness for a more inclusive process. And I think that bodes well for what we're trying to do.
Great. And I see we have about 5 minutes left. Are there more kind of round out things that we want to touch on? Odetta, reflections? Yep. Okay, I see you raising the finger.
Actually, it's a bit of a question. Spark has asked us to try to think about art and culture for all sorts of types of work. Is there a role for arts and culture approaches in that bridge building on the subcommittees of the transition team or inside of the curriculum that you've been developing?
So I know there is an arts and culture committee in the transition. Mm-hmm. So that's being an equal footing with the rest of them, with transit, with housing. That's very, very good to have. I think in our portion that we have contributed is our section is a section on how do we make equitable transit-oriented development a foundational piece of planning in Chicago, right? And we have tried to incorporate the different lenses to a point where they took it out of the committee and made it a cross-committee priority. So we have a bunch of different committees looking at how they can contribute to TOD, an equitable TOD. I don't think that, at least in this round, we're going to get the arts and culture folks to contribute because they are way too busy dealing with some of what they consider the main priorities for the cultural community. But I'm hopeful that there is this first layer of review that is going to include the housing committee review, the neighborhood development review, the environmental committee review, that are going to enrich this approach to TOD. And then I'm hopeful that there's going to be a second layer, probably after the report is out, where we go for the folks who didn't see TOD as part of their foundational stuff, like health, right? Well, we all know it's foundational, but they did not necessarily pick that up. Public safety, and also arts and culture. So it's in our agenda, not yet on the I think on the transition agenda, but we're hoping to get there.
Yeah, and I think what's critical to the, from outside looking in, and also from comments that I've heard, from the transition team's agenda, is just this issue of building trust and having to build trust. And I think that is, with thinking about how do you begin dialogue, how do you share information, how do you highlight narratives. I think that's a place where arts and culture can really support those things. I don't know that they're thinking about them in that way, but I think, that's probably an opportunity.
Great. I do have a question, but I think it's going to take a little bit of a while to answer, but it's on the filter that the mayor uses. So what I'm going to do is hold my question until I see you all in a couple weeks, because then I think we'll have more time to get into it. But I'm going to make the way to say if there are others that have questions, this is the perfect time to do that. If not, if I can get maybe a one sentence kind of wrap up from each of the speakers, that would be great. And then we would be able to kind of say bye and go for the day. And then we'll share all of this information after. Ella will be sure to send out the recording of the webinar. So Dwayne, is there anything that you want to say? Maybe we can go Dwayne, Dr. T, and then go to Chicago and Odetta to close us out.
Now, I like to get the last word, but I'll go first. My sentence would be breathe. That you guys know exactly what to do to move power in community. And the challenge isn't the strategy being off base. The challenge is the strategy is so consuming that we don't have the time to reflect and see what we're doing in conversations like this. So make those spaces. You have allies, tap those allies, trust your instinct, and know that when your North Star is racial equity, you will get to the impact you need.
Yeah, I guess I want to say what he said. I think that's exactly right. I mean, I was as you both were, or all three of you were talking through your strategies. I mean, I was just struck by the incredible kind of meaningfulness and thoughtfulness you put into that. You all are the best in the business in terms of the thinking around these issues. So I would just encourage you to keep going, certainly in making the strongest case that you possibly can. But I think all the things that you articulated are exactly the things that I think both Dwayne and I would say to keep doing. So that's what I would end on. Yep. All good.
Are we going to Chicago?
I don't know who's next. I think we're doing like the around.
Oh, okay.
I was just going to say thank you to the Spark extended family and close family and everyone, because all this stuff that we are passing along to the new mayor has been building on the collective knowledge that you all have been sharing very generously with myself, definitely, and with the entire committee, so the steering committee. So the ETOD memo that we wrote includes things that you're going to recognize from your own work in your different cities, Atlanta, Denver, West Coast folks, Memphis, etc. And all of that is being now passed along. So if you ever question for a minute if you are being meaningful, and if you wonder from your side if you're having impact on other sides, or from the central office if you're having impact, you are, and we're really thankful for that. And you'll see yourselves and your voices in some portions of our work here in Chicago.
And I just want to share a nugget from our last elevated retreat. I think Bina said this, the incremental change is transformational. I think when we started this journey, it felt like we were pushing a boulder up the hill with just some of the conversations around racial equity, and we never thought we would be at this point, with a mayor who supports this, with a county who's adopted it, with other municipalities in the region having the conversation and like saying, hey, what do we do about this? So there is light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, I'll just underscore that. And my last comment will be, I appreciate the reminder. I mean, I think we all feel urgency about it, right? We have loved ones that we're worried about. We have people and communities we care about that are in harm's way right now. So there is this internal combustion engine that's always going to, let's go. So I'm appreciating that we're ending on the slow and steady does indeed win the race. Increments add up to where we're trying to get to, and don't lose sight of your North Star inside of your urgency. So thank you so much for this opportunity. This was really helpful.
Thank you. Woo! All right, you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And I think that's it for us. This was great. I appreciate it.
I'm going to go listen to some Melita Adams.
Oh, yeah. I didn't
Yeah.
right.
Listen,
With
Dwight,
that,
don't make me start singing. Don't make me start singing. You know I'm from Detroit now. Wait now.
we're gonna send the link. Ella, look out for it. I'm gonna send it to you. Okay. Have a
Bye,
good day.
everybody.
Bye.